Nurse Theorists, Portraits of Excellence. In this special two-part edition, we feature Florence Nightingale. In part one, we look at her life and her work.
My father, William Edward Shaw, came from a family well recognized for their sympathy to and support of humanitarian and liberal causes. His grandmother's brother, his great-uncle, Peter Nightingale of Lee, Derbyshire, died, leaving my father at the age of 9, the surviving male heir. When my father became 21 in 1815, he legally assumed the Nightingale name and inherited great wealth. Wen, as he called himself, was well educated and had a reflective, speculative intellect with an indolent, indecisive nature which made it easy for him to avoid argument and conflict. My mother, Frances Smith, who was 6 years older than my father, came from a family of 11 children, 10 of whom survived into old age. The family circle was very large. Papa said we had 27 first cousins and 24 aunts and uncles and 4 grandparents. My mother's father, William Smith, had inherited the family's considerable wealth derived from a merchant business. Much of our family's humanitarian work stemmed from Grandfather Smith's example. Mama was a beauty. Neither my sister Parthy nor I inherited any of her good looks. My mother had a genius of order, the genius to organize a parish to form a society. She had obtained, by her own exertions, the best society in England for us.
William Nightingale and Frances Smith were joined in marriage at St. Margaret's in Westminster in June of 1818. Following their wedding, they embarked upon an extensive wedding trip in southern Europe, mostly in Italy. It was during this extended honeymoon that the Nightingales gave birth to their 2 daughters. Frances Parthenope was born in Naples on April 19, 1819, and on May 12, 1820, Florence was born in the Italian city for which she was named.
Shortly after my birth, Mama began to urge Papa to take us all home to England, and Papa designed Lea Hurst, the home I loved so much. Mama's ambitions required that the family occupy a prominent place in London's social life, and Lea Hurst was too countrified and remote from London and the kind of entertaining she envisioned. So Papa purchased Embley Hall in Hampshire, an estate of 2,000 acres closer to London. I had a sickly childhood. I had weak hands and feet and wore leg braces and steel boots. I was shy to misery. I believed I was different from other people. Meeting new people was a dread. I believed I would make serious social errors in others' presence. The guilt and terror I experienced separated me from others. But the happiest time of my life was during a year's illness, which I had when I was 6 years old. During this time, I first became aware of some kind of a call from God to dedication to His service. I stopped being terrified and began to resist and dislike the life of ease I had.
Life at Embley was very luxurious and comfortable for the Nightingales. Mrs. Nightingale's father had an active social and political life in London. Florence's mother dreamed of a similar life for Florence's father. Wen Nightingale therefore became a candidate for Parliament in 1835. He, however, refused to bribe the voters, as was common practice at this time, which spelled defeat for him and put an end to the political and social lifestyle of Mrs. Nightingale's dreams. Wen, following his defeat, retreated to a quiet life in the social shadows, a lifestyle that certainly did not suit his wife. Mrs. Nightingale promptly turned all of her drive and ambition into creating a proper atmosphere for launching Parthy and Florence into society. The family seemed to be in perpetual motion. Summers at Lea Hurst, part of the fall and spring social seasons at a suite in the Burlington Hotel in London, and most winters were spent in Embley. Florence did not enjoy this lifestyle, however. She took great pleasure in the education that her quiet father provided.
Papa believed that the female mind should be instructed beyond the household arts and needlework, although he entertained no ideas about how to exercise such faculties. So Papa undertook our education, teaching us Latin, Greek, French, German and Italian, social and political history, philosophy, grammar, composition and mathematics. The schedule he set for us was rigorous. To complete my lessons, or to study subjects of great interest to me, I would arise about 4 o'clock. Studying, thinking, reading reports, writing, keeping records, being accurate, detailed, neat and persevering were my trademarks. To Papa, I owe my well-trained intellectual abilities. Parthy was different, not caring overly for these traits or for studying. She was irresponsible, like a butterfly. All the relatives, and even Gail, our nurse, said Parthy had a happy nature and that I did not, but that I had a great desire to be useful. When I studied with Papa and enjoyed our reflective discussions, Parthy joined Mamma in her activities and became resentful of Papa and me.
Parthy and Florence did not get along very well at all until they were in their 40s. Their parents were aware of their incompatibilities and frequent disagreements. Florence certainly realized that her travels to Rome, Paris, Egypt, and Athens were often arranged to pacify her while simultaneously separating her from Parthy.
By the time I reached 16 in 1836, I had put away bandaging and repairing our dolls and was engaged in some useful work. One time I helped the pastor at Embley mend a shepherd's dog's leg. I also nursed villagers who were sick, their ill children, as well as trying to teach them their letters and sums and about God. But in my habit of self-examination, it seemed that I was dreaming more about what I wanted or ought to do than really doing it. But I was not sure what God wanted me to do.
During the winter of 1837, there was much sickness at Embley. In January, the entire Nightingale household had the influenza, save Florence and one servant. For 3 months, Florence nursed her parents, sister, 2 cousins, and 15 servants. It was in the midst of this satisfying experience of being needed and useful that Florence felt her first call from God.
I always remembered the date February the 7th, 1837, as the day God spoke to me and called me to his service, although the path I was to take was not clear to me. All the illness that spring, as well as Mamma's efforts to enlarge and renovate Embley and polish Parthy's and my social graces, which she felt so necessary for brilliant marriages, decided Papa on a continental tour. We left England September the 8th, 1837, and for 19 months made an extensive tour of France and Italy. While we were in Paris, I met Mary Clark, whom I called Clarky. We became great friends. Clarky was independent of traditional conventions, had a wide circle of famous men and women of good breeding and intelligence who shared her human and intellectual interests. From Clarky's lifestyle, I saw that it was possible for a man and a woman to have a close friendship that excluded passion and did not provoke scandal. That became my belief also. During our sojourn abroad, God never spoke to me, and I questioned why, only to realize that I was unworthy. I loved to shine in society, loved pleasure so much. In resolving to make myself worthy to be God's servant, it was necessary for me to overcome the temptation to shine in society and to turn away from that life, which I really did like. This was not easy to do, for Mamma, determined that we should marry well, arranged a very active and extensive social calendar for Parthy and me.
Florence's mother was pleased that Florence had lost her bashfulness and was able to converse on many subjects and in several languages with the notable people that Florence's father knew, especially the men in public office who graced their home. Mrs. Nightingale basked when relatives and friends expressed approval at Florence's grace, charm, and self-assurance.
One of the subjects on which we had heady discussions at home, especially with Aunt Julia and Cousin Hilary, was the position of women question and their power and right to work. From the time I was about 17, I cared for many of my relatives in their illnesses, as well as helping when new babies arrived. I was very glad to walk in the shadow of death, as I did when Grandmother Shaw was threatened with paralysis. There is something in the stillness and silence of it which levels all earthly troubles. God tempers our wings in the stillness of that valley. But the social schedule Mamma established left little, if any, time to engage in study, reflect upon serious subjects, or work among the villagers. I railed, as Clarkey said, with a nailed tongue against my life. While Parthy was contented to stay at home, I desired a more active life outside the family. Still, Mamma insisted we learn to manage a household, but housekeeping tasks made me question the need of so many possessions. I cannot help asking in my head, can reasonable people want all this? Is all that china, linen, glass really necessary? For 6 years after my return from Europe, I struggled to learn how God intended me to serve him, and by 1844 began to believe that nursing was the way. Papa could not understand why I wanted an active life. He said I was vain and selfish. I examined myself about these assertions and believed they were not true. It would mean that God's call to me was a delusion. I saw a poor woman die before my eyes because there was no one but fools to sit up with her, who poisoned her as much as if they had given her arsenic. I had a little plan, which I kept in silence until the fall of 1845. It was to be a nurse at Salisbury Hospital for a few months and learn the pracs. But Mamma was terrified, not only about the physically revolting parts of a hospital, but things about the surgeons and nurses that you may guess. In any event, nothing would be done that year, and I did not believe ever, and I felt no advantage would come of my living on. Yet I was almost heartbroken when Mamma's social plans forced me to leave Lea Hurst. There were so many duties which lay near at hand, and I would have been well content to do them all the days of my life. I left so many poor friends there whom I shall never see again, and so much might have been done for them. I feel my sympathies are with ignorance and poverty. The things which interest me interest my poor friends. We are alike in expecting little from life, much from God. My imagination is so filled with the misery of this world that the only thing which brings relief seems to be helping and sympathizing there.
When Florence was about 24, Lord Ashley Cooper Shaftesbury, the Prussian ambassador Chevalier, and Mrs. Bunsen, people who were all concerned about the quality of Victorian life, began sending Florence government reports and books on social subjects. During a visit to the Nightingale home, the German ambassador Bunsen told Florence about Kaiserswerth, an institution in Germany established by the Lutheran pastor Theodor Fliedner and his wife for the training of deaconesses as nurses.
In 1846, the ambassador sent me the yearbook of the Institution of Deaconesses. I knew that there is my home, there are my brothers and sisters all at work. There my heart is, and there I trust will one day be my body. I dared not mention my desire to go to Kaiserswerth to a soul. During the years that I was participating in the mad social world Mamma provided, and wrestling with my own thoughts about my purpose in life, 2 men proposed marriage to me. When I was about 24, Henry Nicholson, a cousin, insisted on an answer, which had to be no, because we know that intermarriage between relations is in direct contravention to the laws of nature. My parents supported me in this decision, which caused me much pain, and I prayed to cleanse all my love from the desire of creating an interest in another's heart. The second proposal of marriage was much more difficult to refuse. In the intervening 6 or 7 years, I longed for a love so great that we may lay aside all care for our own happiness. I believed that marrying a man of high and good purpose and following out that purpose with him is the happiest state. The highest, the only true love, is when 2 persons, a man and a woman who have an attraction for one another, unite together in some true purpose for mankind and for God. I think God has, however, clearly marked out some to be single women as he has others to be wives, and has organized them accordingly for their vocation.
Richard Monckton Milnes was a charming, witty, well-bred man of many talents. He moved in the best circles of society. Florence and Richard saw more and more of each other over the course of about 8 or 9 years. He shared Florence's social sympathies and concerns, and for several years he asked for her hand in marriage.
In analyzing my feelings about considering marrying him, I realized I have an intellectual nature which requires satisfaction, and that I would find it in him. I have a passionate nature which requires satisfaction, and that I would find it in him. I have a moral and active nature which requires satisfaction, and that I would not find it in his life. I could not satisfy this nature by spending a life with him making society and by arranging domestic things. I could not bear his life, that to be nailed to a continuation and exaggeration of my present life without hope of another would be intolerable to me. My mother was extremely disappointed in my decision to not marry Richard Monckton Milnes, and her anger turned into resentment and hostility toward me and my desire for a life outside the family. It became a contest of wills, as she became very obstinate and determined I should not have my way. Maternal solicitude, love, and kindness were forgotten. At this point in time, I suffered much and said little, but my physical and mental health deteriorated markedly. My dreaming became uncontrollable. Often I was in a trance, losing sense of time and place. Insomnia and pacing in my room occupied my nights. Mamma determined that since I was such a disappointment, I may as well lead a life of refined scholarship and literary ease. So off I went with dear old friends in October 1849 to Egypt, and in early December I began to sail up the Nile. But my dreaming and trances did not cease. The pain was acute, pain from losing Richard Monckton Milnes' constant sympathy, the continual strain of living an inactive life, and the pain of knowing I lacked the purity of motive necessary to fit me for my task when it came. My guilt about my dreaming caused me to believe I was losing my mind, but God called me 3 times, and on March the 7th, 1850, asked me if I would do good for him alone, without the reputation. In the next 2 days I thought much upon this question, and during a half hour I had by myself in the cabin, I settled the question with God. And I strove all my life to disassociate my work for God from any taint of worldliness. In Athens I became 30, the age at which Christ began his mission. Now, no more children things, no more vain things, no more love, no more marriage. Now, Lord, let me only think of thy will. But my dejection really did not leave me. On this trip from Athens and Egypt, I had never felt so bad. The habit of living not in the present but in a future of dreams was gradually spreading over my whole existence. It was rapidly approaching the state of madness when dreams become realities.
Miss Nightingale's spirits finally began to lift during her stay in Berlin. She was able to visit German hospitals and other social institutions. And on July 31st, Florence reached Kaiserswerth.
I could hardly believe I was there, and had the same feeling with which a pilgrim first looks on the Kedron.
But upon returning home, as Miss Nightingale told of her Kaiserswerth experience, violent scenes erupted. Her mother and sister wailed their shame and embarrassment, for they felt their reputations ruined. Miss Nightingale responded as she wrote in her diary on Christmas Eve.
My God, what is to become of me? In my 31st year I can see nothing desirable but death, and yet my present life is suicide. By the time I reached 32, it was obvious to me and Aunt May, Selina Bracebridge, and Elizabeth Herbert that I would have to leave my home in order to pursue my life in useful activities. I returned to Kaiserswerth for about 3 months to better prepare myself for nursing work. Papa, who had become more sympathetic to my interests, settled an annual income on me which assured my independence. Aunt May and Selina were very instrumental in this decision, which in 1853 enabled me to take a position as the unpaid superintendent of an establishment for gentlewomen on Harley Street. In taking this post, however, I stipulated that I would be free to leave after 1 year there.
By October 1854, however, the Crimean War had catapulted the British Empire into a terrible conflict. Newspapers were reporting about the horrible sufferings and neglect of the British soldier. Sidney Herbert, the Secretary of State for War, whom Miss Nightingale had known since meeting him in Rome in the winter of 1847-48, wrote Miss Nightingale asking her if she would undertake, under the auspices of Her Majesty's government, the superintendency of a group of English women to be sent out as nurses. He proposed it as an experiment to demonstrate the efficacy of introducing women nurses into military hospitals. Miss Nightingale's letter to Sidney Herbert's wife Elizabeth crossed Sidney's letter in the mail. In Miss Nightingale's letter to Elizabeth, she volunteered to go out with one other nurse at her own expense. After lengthy discussion, however, Miss Nightingale accepted Mr. Herbert's offer, and within 10 days, the original Nightingale Crimea nursing party of 38 was organized and left London for Scutari.
All in all, I had 125 women under my authority, although there were 229 who served in the various hospitals there. Scutari and the Crimea were two crucibles to test endurance, and I resolved to stand out the war with any man. Memories of the frozen and starved, wounded, sick, dying and dead were seared into my soul, as were callousness, ignorance, neglect and wanton disregard for human life on the part of British military officers. 10,000 soldiers died in the 6 months' colossal calamity of that terrible winter of 1854 to 1855. Not a man arose to say, "This shall not be," and to show how it need not be, to suggest an organization to save the army. Who will find the truth and tell it in the way that rouses a generation? I stand at the altar of murdered men, and while I live, I fight their cause. Such were the reasons why I put nursing interests aside and devoted the next 10 to 15 years of my life to military reform.
After returning to England, Miss Nightingale spent 2 years researching and writing a report on the health efficiency and hospital administration of the British Army during the Crimean War. Miss Nightingale chronicled, detailed, charted, and graphed the lessons of the Crimean War. Very powerful conclusions and recommendations were drawn from Florence's research. Her statistical data revealed the British soldier essentially enlisted to his death, since the majority of deaths were due to preventable illnesses such as starvation and lack of sanitation. Miss Nightingale cited example upon example of soldiers that died not of battle wounds, but of the need for improved administration, better training of military physicians, or the keeping of more accurate medical statistics. This report was requested by Lord Panmure, the Secretary of State for War at this time.
I believed in the power of the pen and the power of statistics. That report, and my reports to the several royal commissions on the British Army, contained much convincing statistical data which Parliament and the War Office found hard to ignore, nor did I let them. During my work at Scutari, and after I recovered from a near-fatal attack of Crimean fever, the British people desired to present me with a personal testimonial. I rejected all suggestions save that which would permit me to continue my work, perhaps like an English Kaiserswerth. Well, there I was in Scutari, surrounded by dirt, disease, the dying and the dead, and the committee to collect the fund to establish a school for nurses asked me for the plan for the school. People seemed to think I had nothing to do but sit at Scutari and make plans. I responded that if the public chose to recognize my services and my judgment in this manner, they must leave those services and that judgment unfettered. Hence, the creation of the Nightingale Fund resulted in the establishment of the School of Nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital, which in 1860 I lodged in the hands of Sarah Wardroper, matron of the hospital, and went on with my work in military reform until about 1872. The disaster of the Crimean War convinced me that the health of the army was largely dependent upon the health of the British citizenry from which they enlisted. So I urged the teaching of health to mothers and the establishment of district nursing for the care of the sick at home. Because every woman at some part of her life has the charge of a family member, I wrote Notes on Nursing in 1860. This little book was meant simply to give hints for thought to women who have personal charge of the health of others. The notes were by no means intended to teach nurses to teach themselves to nurse, still less as a manual to teach nurses to nurse. Social customs of my day prohibited a woman from holding public office, but the need for reform and change was great, so I resolved to use the power of my name behind the scenes and in writing about issues such as prostitution, land reform and irrigation in India, famine, emigration, Bulgarian atrocities, and religion. And for many years, associates and friends were in strategic or well-placed government, military, and civil positions. In this way, I was able to help the health and welfare of the British soldier, as in creating more livable housing, the sanitation of the army in India, establishing a school for the training of the army medical officer, the sanitary construction of military hospitals, the reform of workhouses and the introduction of nursing there, as well as into military hospitals in peacetime and midwifery. My life saw many new and heady scientific discoveries, such as the germ theory, which I rejected. I never forgot the lessons learned at Scutari. What I couldn't see, I didn't believe. I saw the results of dirt in Scutari, and it was dirt, not germs, that helped destroy the British Army. My correspondence came from all over the world, and I willingly shared my advice and opinions about sanitation, health, nursing, and education as I believe they ought to be, and uninfluenced too much by the scientific revolution or social change. The development of nursing schools followed Mrs. Wardroper's design at St. Thomas's. By 1872, when the other pressures of my work lessened and I had the opportunity to turn my attention to the school there, the system was pretty embedded. But corrections were indicated, and slowly they were implemented. But few persons ever read my philosophical or religious treatises, in which I described the laws governing the universe, God's purpose for man, or man's place in an interactive universe. Nor did they reconcile my concepts of an earlier age with a rapidly changing technological and industrial era. But my followers certainly carried my message that nursing was the promotion of health, the restoration of the human being to a healthy state, and the prevention of disease. The basis of nursing is the emphasis upon the human being, the environment, health, and the provision of the humanitarian service called nursing. Many honors were given to me, but most of all I acknowledge the development of statistics as a science, the civilization of hospitals, military and medical reform, hospital nursing and midwifery, and district or visiting nursing.
By 1902, Miss Nightingale was confined to her bed. However, she still received important visitors. Her memory, eyesight, and mental apprehension were failing. When King Edward VII wrote to offer Miss Nightingale the Order of Merit, the first woman to be so honored, all she could say was,
"Too kind, too kind,"
on its presentation. A short recording on an old wax cylinder in 1890, made by Miss Nightingale in a message to the Army, is all that remains of Miss Nightingale's voice.
When I am no longer even a memory, just a name, I hope my voice may perpetuate the great work of my life. God bless my dear old comrades of Balaclava and bring them safe to shore.
She never did forget her Crimean comrades. In this second part of our special edition on Florence Nightingale, Dr. Jacqueline Fawcett interviews Dr. Monica Bailey of the Royal College of Nursing and Dr. Lois Montero of Brown University on Miss Nightingale's work and her theory.
Lois and Monica, I'd like to thank you so very much for agreeing to do this interview. I'm sure that your knowledge of Florence Nightingale is going to enlighten our viewers.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to have been asked over.
I'd like to start by asking you about Notes on Nursing. It seems to me that Notes on Nursing is Florence Nightingale's best-known publication. Could you tell us what is the significance of the book? What contribution did Notes on Nursing make to nursing as a discipline?
Well, I think we have to remember that Notes on Nursing was written in 1859, so it's a very early publication, and she hadn't really clarified her ideas about nursing then. You know, she starts off by saying, I use the term nursing for want of a better. But I think it's important on two counts. First of all, the things she has to say about nursing and care are timeless. There's a lot of things that are about not making a noise over the patient, not talking over the patient, whispering within his hearing and so forth, bustle, unnecessary noise, and so on. A lot of what she has to say is timeless. But I think it's also important on the second count, and that is it's an unwitting testimony to the way people were nursed in the middle of the 19th century. You know, you see them with their closed curtains and these cloistered rooms and so forth. So I think it's interesting to the historian also, apart from was interesting to nurses. But as I say, I think the most important thing about it is that some of the advice that she has to give is timeless, and it does to some extent precede the nursing process. You know, she said it all before.
I would add that you have to remember that it wasn't written as a nursing textbook. It was written as a statement for people who were taking care of sick people, assuming those were women in general. But so basically for women who had to take care of sick people in their homes. So it was not really a nursing textbook. The other thing I would add is that I think that the reawakening of what's in that book in the past 20 years is very, very exciting, because the things that are in Notes on Nursing are, in fact, some of the things that we're talking about now.
Could you give us an example?
Well, the concern about the patient's environment, the concern about the patient's living conditions, the concern about the patient, I suppose, is the way I would put it, that's in that book.
Of course, the other thing we haven't mentioned, and that is that she does lay down in the book, and this really was revolutionary, that nurses must be trained.
Yes, good
that
point.
they must be trained particularly in observation and in recording. And that really was quite revolutionary.
What do you think motivated her to write the book?
Well, that book was written while she was also doing 3 or 4 other very important things. It was written in the period after the Crimea and before the opening of St. Thomas's. So during that time, she was also writing a report for the Royal Commission on War and Army Reform, hospital construction, making comments on the way hospitals should be built, the way medical education in the Army should take place, and so forth. And her little book on nursing, as she called it, was also being written at the same time. So I think that another amazing part of it is that it was one of a number of compartments of ideas and activities that she was working on at that time.
Monica, you had mentioned earlier that this was a very early view of nursing. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, while some of what she has said is timeless, as you both indicated, what changed? What was her later work about, and how did it differ from what's in Notes on Nursing?
Well, I think she changes her mind about nursing. At that stage, when she wrote Notes on Nursing, she had no idea how nurses should be trained. She says when she's in the Crimea, when she's offered the Nightingale Fund, she says, she was asked if she had a plan. And she said, I have no plan. If I had a plan, it would be to put myself in the poorest hospital in London and see what I could do, not touching the fund for years. She had no idea at that stage how nurses ought to be trained. And her whole approach to nurse training is extremely pragmatic. She looks at all the theory, or at all the systems there are. She looks at the religious orders, to which she was very much attracted, but she didn't want interference from chaplains. She looked at the army and the discipline of the army. She thought that the discipline was good. She'd had ladies in a big way in the Crimea. She didn't want to be burdened with ladies any longer because she thought they didn't accept discipline. And she'd looked at the ordinary hospital nurse, the hardy hospital nurse. And what she wanted was the best of all. She wanted an amalgam of religion, of devotion, of moral earnestness, and of hardiness. And of course, what she was really looking for was a paragon. And I think this is one of the legacies that she has left us, actually. You know, this paragon that it really isn't there.
What did you mean by ladies?
Oh, the ladies who came out of the Crimea, the aristocratic ladies who came out to the Crimea. As you realise, you know, they all came out as like tourists. And it wasn't that she didn't have enough nurses in the Crimea. She almost had too many because, you know, they came out like tourists and offered help. But they were not subject to discipline. That was her problem.
What I would add is that she was concerned about, the word she uses is amateurs, that she didn't want amateurs coming in and thinking that they could do nursing. And there was a woman who wrote a paper, Elizabeth Garrett, wrote a paper saying ladies could do nursing because they supervise cooking and dusting in their own homes, therefore why couldn't they do nursing? And that really irritated Florence. I mean, she got furious and wrote attempted to write a letter to Macmillan's magazine saying, if you print anything more from this woman and so forth. She didn't send that letter, but the fury was over the thought that one didn't need to be trained, that an amateur, a lady, because a lady had been educated in the ways of how to manage a household, couldn't do nursing as far as Nightingale, and of course couldn't. I mean, of course we would agree with that too.
So clearly then Nightingale was saying that nursing is something beyond housekeeping.
Yes, it's an art. She very often said it's an art that requires learning. You have to learn the technique of the art in order to perform the art.
Training, observation, recording. But interesting enough about ladies, I mean, she says, she is contradictory in a way, because later on she says, rather than establish a religious order, I would open a career highly paid. But undoubtedly, the ladies will rise to the position of superintendent, but not because they are ladies, but because they are educated. She didn't. She wanted ladies who were educated and who would be subject to her discipline. You see, this was the problem of the Crimea. You know, they wouldn't be subject to her discipline, and this is what she fought about. Nurses had to be disciplined and had to be obedient, do as they were told.
Inasmuch as we've been talking about the training necessary to become a nurse, what impact, both immediate and long-term, did Nightingale's work have on nursing education, first in England and then later in the United States? How were schools organized?
That's really Monica's area of expertise, so let her begin.
Well, how did she start her training in England? Well, it was really very pragmatic and very haphazard. She had this Nightingale Fund to start her training, which had been donated by the grateful public, £45,000. And she really wasn't interested in it. She had other things to do at that time. As Lewis has said, she was interested in reforming the Army Medical Service, and of course, if necessary, the Army itself.
Well, of course.
The Army itself.
Only to the top.
And the Barrack Commission and so on. So she pushed nursing really into the background. And as I said before, she hadn't really got a plan for nursing. It so happened that in the course of what I can only describe as a Byzantine intrigue with St. Thomas's Hospital, they actually offered to take her school of nursing. And she put up a plan. Now, we haven't got that plan, unfortunately. That's one of the bit of archives that are lost. But what we have got is a counter plan that St. Thomas's put up. And it really was quite disgraceful, because they more or less were accepting the fund's money and taking the probationers that they were proposing to put there and use them as assistant nurses and labour. And the fund were going to pay part of the matron's salary and part of the medical superintendent's salary and so forth. And at that stage, Sidney Herbert died, Clough died, and she was in despair, and she took really no notice. The school started, and for 7 years, practically, she took no interest in the school. And I mean, the first years of the Nightingale School really were a failure. I mean, it's a myth to suggest that it was anything otherwise. Then, when eventually they started to get a few better type candidates, because Mrs. Waldroper had chosen working class girls, and what they discovered, of course, was they ought to have known in the first place, was that working class girls, fine though they were not capable of training other people. So there was no one to train. There was no trainer there. There was no one to train the students coming on. And when they did start to get rather better class girls, then they began to complain to Miss Nightingale that there were no lectures given, and so on. And that is when then they begin to reassess the situation at St. Thomas's Hospital and find it wanting. And they talk about taking all the money away from St. Thomas's, but then very difficult to find anywhere else to have them, because nobody else wanted a cuckoo in their nest, you see.
The other hospitals just wouldn't have accepted it beforehand, and certainly wouldn't have accepted it later.
But eventually...
Well, eventually it became clear that nursing students were a way for hospitals that needed working staff to have a staff, and I think that the beginning of hospitals in the U.S. and the growth of nursing schools in the U.S. come together, because that's the only way hospitals, in fact, could begin to be established, if they established a school. And so the idea was spread very rapidly, not necessarily as an educational idea, but rather as an economic idea, a way to make hospitals viable as hospital technology was changing, as hospitals were needing more qualified people. The two things could work together.
It would seem then that Nightingale's major contribution to nursing education was the fact that nurses should be trained, rather than the way in which they were trained. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's true. That's very true. I think the important thing also was that she did prove that nurses could be trained in a secular situation. That was a very important contribution in the Victorian period, because everybody believed that she was going to start a religious order. And so she proved that nurses of any creed, any sect, could be trained as nurses in an ordinary hospital in a secular situation.
And actually, the nurses, they didn't have the same kind of training in the secular orders, but they certainly had some kind of supervision and some kind of, in other words, the religious orders had some training. It hadn't been the same kind of training that comes later, but it wasn't as though those were totally unsupervised, untrained, unthought through processes that were going on in the religious orders. And certainly that's what you went to look for.
Monica, earlier you mentioned that the working class girls who early on came into St. Thomas's Hospital weren't capable of supervising or training the next cadre of students. Was that because of their lack of education?
It's partly because of their lack of education, and it's partly because there was no one at St Thomas's to train them. They had no very good example. As it was Shaw Smith who said, the chief trainer at St Thomas's is a drinking woman. And so they had no one, they had no one at Thomas's really capable of training them. Miss Nightingale, when she's looking at their character sheets and their diaries, says time and again, she would have made a good nurse had she had better supervision. It wasn't that these girls couldn't be made into good nurses, but they didn't have any supervision. And this was a real fundamental problem of St Thomas's, that until they had actually been going for about 20 years and had actually trained their own nurses who they could send out or train as what Miss Nightingale would call trained as trainers, then you really couldn't have the system going. But it was very much an apprenticeship system, of course. And as we know, it was very much exploited.
Did Nightingale ever express any disappointment or dismay or even guilt that she stayed home and didn't participate in the training of the nurses?
No, I wouldn't say, I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. She was much too busy with other things. It was quite late on in her life that she gets really very sentimental about the nurses at St Thomas's. But I mean, on the whole, she was very much too busy, doing other things. What she did express her disappointment about, though, she expressed her disappointment about the training very, very pungently, many times and over. She says, we were the making of St Thomas's, they are the unmaking of us. Our probationers are worked so hard, they are doing half the hospital's work. She says to Bonham Carter, if they didn't have our probationers, they would have to double their budget. Well, she could say that time and again, couldn't she? Well into the 50s and the 60s.
But she would have expressed much more disappointment over other things. For example, when the Royal Commission report came out and Parliament didn't act to change laws about the Army, she said, all is lost, it was in our grasp. And her disappointment and anger and not necessarily, I don't think she had guilt about anything. You use the word guilt, and I have trouble seeing her as feeling guilty about anything. But in terms of anger and disappointment, it was more that she couldn't make other things happen that she really wanted to make happen. And as far as nursing went, I think she felt that with the establishment of the school, she had done what she could do.
What she could do, yes.
And so she just didn't see that she had a role in the day-to-day training of the nurses.
No. Well, I suppose she did in a way, because after the Great Row in 1872, she starts seeing the probationers, and this is very interesting. They have to come, and visit her in South Street. It really must have been a most dreadful situation, because these poor little things trailed up to South Street. And she looked at the register that Mrs. Wardrope had kept and looked at the remarks that Mrs. Wardrope had made, and then she made her own assessment and then scribbled across the register what she thought about them. Flighty, not fit to be left on a ward with male patients, etc. How poor Mrs. Wardrope had coped, I really don't know. But she did see the probationers herself and made her assessments on them.
Ultimately, what do you think Miss Nightingale's influence on nursing as a practice discipline was? How did her work and her ideas influence the practice of nursing?
She made it possible. I think we have to give her credit for having made it possible. And also, I think, in a negative kind of way, I think some of her ideas, particularly this overstress on discipline and calling, and some of those ideas had a negative long-term effect on nursing. But I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that she made a secular nurse and also took the idea of a woman being able to have an occupation, an independent occupation through which she could earn money, and that would be a respectable occupation. She made all those things possible. Now, with it, she added, but they must be biddable, as she would say. They must do as they are bid. They must be disciplined. They must be moral. They must be all of those other things that we now say were too exaggerated or were false.
I think there's an interesting thing that comes out of this, that in a short space of time, probably around about the 1880s, 1890s, because there is no other occupation for women, nursing, particularly in the big teaching hospitals in England, becomes what she calls fashionable. And the nurses themselves then become rather conceited. Now, she is always complaining about this. In her, you remember her addresses to
the addresses to the
probationers. She's always warning them about the dangers of conceit. And it's true, they were conceited because everybody said what wonderful administering angels they were. They were doing this noble work for long hours, very little pay, and so on and so forth. And the people who came after her, I maintain, clung to the system that made them so admired. And they tended, instead of as she would have changed the system, I'm quite sure, had she lived, she would have changed the system, because after all, it was supposed to be a humble experiment, but the humble experiment was suddenly set in concrete, and it became our nursing tradition. And, you know, this is the whole point of my thing about Florence Nightingale and the nursing legacy. This was the nursing legacy, but we shouldn't blame Florence Nightingale for it, because I'm quite sure, as I say, had she lived, she would have changed the system. And indeed, towards the end of her life, you see, she was putting all her energies into community nursing, yes, and health visiting. In fact, you see, I think the Thomases nurses on the whole had disappointed her, because they'd had become what she called medical women. They had followed the medical model. And so she now changed, she now turns her attention to home nursing and the district in what we call district nursing in England, and indeed in health visiting and preventive medicine. And I would maintain that this was a greater contribution to health care than actually her contribution to hospital nursing.
Well said. I agree.
Will you agree?
I agree fully, and I agree. The only additional thing I would add is also that with the health visiting and going into the workhouses and into the workhouse, yes, infirmaries, she began to do to go beyond just illness, but more into preventive medicine, public health, but also social change. The need, for example, the need for reading rooms. That there had to be reading rooms that people could go into, and there had to be other things other than being able to just do nothing or drink. Again, she is very moral about things.
Very moral.
but if we could only provide other outlets for people, and so I think she goes beyond illness, yeah, very clearly.
Who or what influenced Miss Nightingale? In other words, what was the impact of her family background and her own education on her ability to do what she did, and in the way that she did it?
Well, it was very largely, of course, her family. She comes from a very liberal background. Both her father and her mother's side. On her mother's side, they were connected, or they were friends of the Wilberforces, for example, and the Clapham set. So she was very much into that liberal movement at the in the 1820s and the 1830s. She was very largely educated by her father, although she did have a separate tutor for maths. But she was educated by her father. Really given the sort of education that a man would have been given. She really did have a man's education. And of course she was lucky that she travelled and she spoke languages. She spoke about 3 or 4 languages quite fluently.
I think she was really a privileged, she came from a privileged background,
oh, yes, yes,
and also was given I think even though in the myth of Nightingale, her family is overpowering and so forth, nevertheless, she had a great deal of freedom within her family, and was able to live in Paris for a while, was able to visit Rome without her family, but with other family friends, was able to visit in Egypt, traveled well beyond even what an ordinary privileged lady in England would have done. So she was well beyond, I think, the average.
She had a very privileged upbringing.
I had the opportunity when I was at the University of Alabama at Birmingham recently to read some of her original letters. And the impression I got from reading those letters was that she had a considerable concern about her own health. She mentions her eyes and being very concerned about her eyes failing. And the other concern was very much sanitation.
Yes, yes, yes. This is in her old age, of course. This is in her old age, yes, yes.
But even in her younger age, very often her letters begin with, I am a prisoner to my bed, I have been unable, one of her lines is, I am here sick and the world brings me its troubles, and I have to, and then she will go on for 5 pages of, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do, this is what I think, this is what I believe, and, but would always begin, or comment, in most of her letters, comment in some way on her health. I'm not well, even when one, by the rest of the letter, one would guess that she was really very strong.
Yeah. I have a little more to do in 24 hours than can be done in one day. I am worked on a treadmill, and so it goes on. She did exaggerate, of course, everything, you know. Everything comes 1 octave up, so to speak.
Do you think that she used her so-called ill health as a weapon or as a way of manipulating the situation?
Yes,
yes,
definitely.
Very much so.
She could control people. She could manipulate people. She could make them come to her. She could limit what she didn't have to, she could limit when she would see them, for how long she would see them, what she would talk to them about, and so she was able to use that illness, although I don't want to discount the fact that she might also have had some illness.
Florence Nightingale did so much in her lifetime, but if you had to identify the one single most outstanding or significant contribution that she made, what would that be, Lois?
I think clearly the making it possible for nursing to become a secular, educated profession, although I don't mean that her act made it a profession, but making it possible and breaking from Victorian beliefs and Victorian authorities to do that, and it has to be nursing. Nursing, despite the fact that that might not have been what she would have wanted her greatest contribution to be, that has to be it. There's no question, in my mind anyway.
Monica?
I think probably her contribution to public health and sanitation and preventive medicine is probably greater than her contribution in a way to general nursing, because general nursing, nurse training would have happened in any case because of the changes in medicine. It was bound to happen at some time. Whether it would have happened the way it did is arguable, but I suspect it would. I suspect it would, hospitals being what they are, and the position of women being what it is, you see, or was at that stage. Nurses would have been, nurses would have been exploited anyhow, because there was no other work for them to do. So if they went into hospitals, they were poorly paid. They were glad to have a job anyhow, a respectable job. Once it was made respectable, I think it would have become respectable in any case, regardless of Miss Nightingale. This is really what I'm saying. And the nurses, you know, hospitals being poor, would have exploited nurses, and women have been exploited. It's just women being exploited, partly.
What do you think she wanted her greatest contribution to be?
I think she wanted it to be her effect on the army and on the
Yes,
sanitation.
yeah.
Well, sanitation fits in there. The army and hospital construction and the making the army and the Army Medical Corps, but the army in general better.
Yeah.
And more responsible to its soldiers,
Yeah.
more responsible for its soldiers' health. I think that she saw that, coming back from the Crimea, she saw the phrase we use now is window of opportunity. She saw a window of opportunity to really change the British military system. You have to remember that the military system was a very important part of Britain's history.
That's right. Yeah, well, I stand at the altar of murdered men, and while I live, I will fight their cause. And that was her thought throughout life, I think. And at the end, I mean, where did she want to be buried? She wanted she wanted to go back to Scutari. That's where she wanted to be buried. In the end, she was buried in Wellow, but carried by the soldiery, whom she loved. You know, yes, I think I would agree that. The other thing also, what she said very often was, I'm here to prevent unnecessary suffering. See, she wasn't there, in fact, she didn't see herself being there as to provide a career for women.
No.
This was incidental. This was incidental. I'm there, my aim is to prevent unnecessary suffering. And if by having good nursing, then you prevented suffering, that was a good thing. But that was incidental.
What do you think gave her the most satisfaction in her life?
Gave her the most satisfaction.
That's a hard question, because
Very hard.
she was not a woman who was very satisfied.
She was never satisfied, really. I'm trying to think.
Well, late in life, certainly.
Late in life, yes. Actually, like all artists, in a way, she was dissatisfied with everything she had done. I don't think the school at St. Thomas's gave her much satisfaction.
No, I don't think so either.
I don't think that gave her
And
much satisfaction. I think she was furious when the Poor Law Amendment Act wasn't the way she wanted it, the way she had drafted the bill. The bill was in my grasp and I have lost it. But I think she had some quiet satisfaction about improvements in the Poor Law towards the end of her life. And I think she certainly had some satisfaction in district nursing and community nursing.
Yes, I agree with that. I think she was more satisfied with that.
Very interesting. She says, she frequently says, hospitals are an intermediate stage of civilization. I like that. Hospitals are an intermediate stage of, and also, I look to the day when there are no hospitals for the sick or infirmaries, but no use to look to the year 2000.
Yes, and those her comments on public health and her understanding of some of those issues went so deep into her beliefs and to her whole career or her whole lifetime. And I do think she got satisfaction from that.
Yeah.
And towards the end, she got satisfaction out of, let me make her a person for a moment. Kittens. She had kittens and cats. And she got satisfaction out of her cats and out of sending good butter and cheese to making sure that the children in the schoolhouse down in Embley had provisions and so forth. So towards the end of her life, she got satisfaction out of what
and out of a very large
things.
circle of friends and relatives too, the younger generation too. I mean, she was a very indulgent aunt at the end.
Yes, she hadn't been very kind to her relatives early on in life, but
towards the end she becomes very sentimental, actually.
As we draw the interview to a close, I wonder, is there anything else you'd like to tell our viewers about Miss Nightingale? Is there any summarization of her life and her career and her work that you'd like to add?
My concern, I think, about Nightingale is that we focus too narrowly on her, and that we need to, and with the coming of interest in nursing history on the base from women historians who are interested more in social history, I think we'll get a broader, or a more complete picture of Nightingale the woman as well as Nightingale the person who worked in the Crimea and opened the school. And I think we have to see the full Nightingale, not just the nursing Nightingale. And I think that's very important.
Yes, the Crimea is a very small part of her life. I think you've got to see her whole life in perspective. And I would say, please don't confuse what we call the Nightingale tradition with what Miss Nightingale would have had if she was alive today. I think if she were alive today and were realised that this apprenticeship system and the system that started at St Thomas's was going on into the 1950s, she would turn in her grave. Because the other thing I think to say, people were saying, we were saying this yesterday about, you know, is there anybody else to take Miss Nightingale? Is there a nurse today who you could say would, you know, measure up to Miss Nightingale? Well, my answer to that one, if Miss Nightingale was alive today, she wouldn't have been a nurse, she'd have been a Minister of Health.
Yes, at least.
Yes, yes.
If not Prime Minister.
Yeah.
In closing, then, I'd like to thank you again very, very much for agreeing to do the interview. You have more than met the expectations of anyone who will watch this video in informing us of Miss Nightingale's life. Thank you very much, Lois. Thank you very much, Monica.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. It's been fun as well as...
As Miss Nightingale would have said, too
kind,
kind.